In the second lesson of this unit of work on ecology, you'll have been looking at abiotic and biotic factors. Now, in the first lesson, you will have looked at the fact that an ecosystem is often at equilibrium or stable. It's balanced. Population numbers might go up and down over time, but overall they stay at a relatively constant level. Now, abiotic and biotic factors are things that can affect the balance of an ecosystem. So, in a nutshell, they are things that can affect population numbers of different organisms within a community. And this is often due to the idea of interdependence that we talked about last lesson, in terms of these organisms being dependent on each other for survival. Now, they are split into these two categories. Abiotic factors are non-living things that can affect the balance of an ecosystem, whereas biotic factors are living things that can affect the balance of an ecosystem. So if we talk about abiotic factors, these are things like light, oxygen, carbon dioxide, temperature, moisture levels, soil pH, mineral content, wind intensity. These are all things that are not alive. Oxygen is not alive, the wind is not alive, temperature is not alive, but they can affect an ecosystem. So if you think about things like light, oxygen, carbon dioxide, temperature, moisture, these all affect photosynthesis, for example. And if these levels are reduced, if you've got less of those, you might have less photosynthesis, less plants growing. And if you've got less plants growing, these plants might serve as a food source for another organism, which means they have less of a food source, which if this organism that depends on plants has less of a food source, then that might affect their population numbers also. Wind intensity, for example, as well affects transpiration, so the amount of water that can move through a plant. Again, that affects the plant in terms of its lifespan, its ability to survive, which can then have a knock-on impact due to interdependence onto other organisms that eat it. Whereas biotic factors, on the other hand, are living factors. So these are things that involve living organisms that can affect population numbers within a community. So the first idea would be competition. Competition either within a species, within a species, which is intra, I-N-T-R-A, or between different species, I-N-T-E-R. And they are often, if we're thinking about survival, competing for the availability of food. And if one organism loses that competition, they have less access to food, which means they are less likely to survive, which will affect their population numbers. Now, the arrival of a new predator can also have an impact in that this new predator comes into an ecosystem, starts to consume other organisms, which can affect the number of those organisms available for other animals that are also trying to eat them. So an example of this might be the introduction of the grey squirrel into the native red squirrel habitat, which has led to a decrease in the population of red squirrels. And this is because grey squirrels outcompete red squirrels for food and shelter. Now, as well as introduction of a new predator, another living factor that can affect population numbers is if a pathogen, a new pathogen arrives within an ecosystem. So a pathogen is a disease-causing microorganism. So if a population of a particular organism gets a disease, it may be that that organism dies off as a result of that disease, which means their population numbers go down, and that can also have an impact on other organisms. So competition for the availability of food, predators and prey relationships, and pathogens are all biotic factors. So make sure from this lesson you can remember the difference between abiotic being a non-living factor and a biotic factor being a living factor that affects the balance, or in other words, the equilibrium of an ecosystem.